Hi, I'm Mike from 1A Auto. We've been selling auto parts for over 30 years.
In this video, we are replacing a front lower ball joint in a 2008 Subaru Outback. Unfortunately, when we removed the pinch bolt, it broke due to corrosion and New England rust. This kind of thing happens. It will ruin your day, it'll give you a headache, but we will show you how we fixed it. If you need any parts that we used in this video, click the link in the description and head over to 1aauto.com. We're going to use a 19mm socket and a breaker bar to take the lug nuts. Just break them free before we put the vehicle up in the air. Now take the lug nuts off with the socket. Now pull the wheel off. I'm going to use a 15mm socket and a ratchet. Take this nut off here, loosen it up. As you can see, this part is spinning, so we're going to need a wrench to go on there. With an 18mm wrench, I can slide it right there, and then use my socket and ratchet. And the wrench will hold the stud from spinning. And we'll pull the nut out. We'll do the same for the top. We'll pull our nut off. Pull the link out. Push the, comes right up. We're going to use some rust penetrant on this bolt right here for the ball joint, and there's a slot right here on the knuckle. I'm going to spray some in there because the ball joint is probably going to be frozen when we go to take it out. So if you let it soak for a little bit, that'll help when taking out. I'm going to remove this bolt on the knuckle. We're going to use a 14mm socket and a ratchet. Oh, it just broke. Our ball joint bolt actually broke in the knuckle, so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to extract it. To do that, we're going to actually pull the whole knuckle out. So I'm going to pull this part of the bolt out with some locking pliers. I'll use a little screwdriver underneath and just go back and forth, prying out with the screwdriver or a pry bar. As you can see, it broke right there. So I'm going to use some side cutters and pull this cotter pin down. Pull this out so that we can get this castle nut off. Pull it right there, and you can pull it out this way. And grab it and pull it right out. Now I'm going to use a 19mm socket and a ratchet. Take off this lower ball joint nut. All right, I'm going to leave it right there for now. Since we're not reusing the ball joint anyway, I'm going to use a pickle fork. If you do, you're going to want to be careful doing this because you could damage the boot. And a hammer, I'm going to tap to release the ball joint. There we go. Now I'm going to leave that right there loose like that. I'm going to take the tie rod end off and then the upper bolts, and we'll take that off later. So we're going to take this nut off, but there's a little section where it's been peened over so that it will lock and won't move. We're going to have to use a punch and a hammer and bang it back a little bit. And we're going to stick a pry bar right here. That's going to lock our hub so it doesn't spin when we go to loosen this nut. Put it down to the ground on the left side, and we're able to loosen our nut. It's a 34mm socket. That nut is very tight, so it's hard to do. But now that it's loose, we can go back up. We'll take this nut off. Then we're gonna use a punch and a hammer and bang them. Oh, this one's very loose, but if yours was more rusted on there more, you would have to bang that in. So we're gonna take these two caliper bracket bolts out, and we'll take the whole caliper off as a whole. This is a 17mm socket and a ratchet. Before we take that bolt out, we're gonna break the top one free. Take those two bolts out. You can gently pry the caliper back. I'm going to use a bungee cord, stick it through the caliper bracket. There. Just keep the caliper out of the way. Now I'm going to pull the rotor off. So we're going to take this castle nut out, but there is a cotter pin. So we're going to use our diagonal cutters. All right, so then we'll bend it back. I'm going to use this little punch, try to bang it. Try to get it through the eye of the cotter pin and pry it out. We want to get that piece out. I was able to move that out a little bit, and I'm going to cut it off the best I can. When in doubt, if you can't get the cotter pin out, just try to bend it out of the way. And when you twist the castle nut, it'll actually just shear off the remainder of the cotter pin, which will be okay. It's just going to be harder to turn the nut, but we'll still be able to turn it. We're going to use a 19mm socket, extension, and a breaker bar. We're going to loosen that castle nut and hopefully shear off that cotter pin. Yep, see? Just go back and forth just to make sure it's good. Now we can just use a regular ratchet. Now we can pull it right off. All right, so I'm going to put the nut back on for right this second, and then I'm going to use a punch and a hammer and hammer it right down, right in the center of the stud, like this. And I'm going to break it free. Now that it's free, I'll take my nut off. And there you can see that's where the cotter pin is. We can use a small punch and punch it through, or even a drill bit, a small enough drill bit, and drill it through. All right, so we're gonna take these two nuts and bolts out. This bolt is actually cammed, so you wanna make sure you have an alignment done after you're done. But before we take it out, I'm just gonna mark where the knuckle goes to the strut, and also we're going to mark the top of the bolt so that we know when we put it back that the bolt faces upwards. So then at least when it goes back together, we know our camber reading will be close. You still want to have an alignment done or checked to make sure so you don't have excessive tire wear. So we're going to take a 19mm wrench, 19mm socket and ratchet, and loosen up these nuts and bolts. This one has a washer. Pull the nut off in the washer. You should be able to slide the bolt out. As you can see, this is the cam that I was talking about on the bolt. And loosen up the bottom one the same way. Pull the nut off. You can pull that bolt out. Separate the knuckle from the strut. We're gonna pull the speed sensor out. There's a 10mm bolt that goes in here, 10mm socket, extension and a ratchet to get it out. Pull that bolt out. I'm gonna try a straight blade screwdriver right under this little tab. Just pry up on it a little bit. Now it is plastic, so you want to be careful. Don't want to pry it too much. And with my needle nose pliers, go back and forth with the screwdriver and the needle nose, and eventually it should come out. There we go. And there it is. So now we're going to push the axle through. Pull that out of the way. And then, because we broke this free earlier, this is nice and loose. Pull that castle nut off, the whole knuckle, and pull right out. So we installed our knuckle into a vise here, so it's easier to work on. Because of where our bolt broke, right in the center there, a part of the old bolt that's still stuck in there is holding our ball joint in, so we can't pull that out until we drill that out. So we're gonna have to drill it out first, and then we'll be able to remove the ball joint. So I want to clean this area out, so I'm using this wire brush on the end of a drill. Just clean it out a little bit, because I'm going to try to put this guide in that'll help make my drill, when I drill in, it go straighter. So just want to clean that out a little bit. Just like that. We can put our guide in. Use our titanium drill bits. We're going to use a little bit of rust penetrant. We're using the rust penetrant to cool it down. Otherwise, we're going to burn the drill bit out faster. Pull the guide off at this point. Oh, all the way through. We're going to clean this up a little bit with a little bit of brake parts cleaner, just to get some of the rust penetrant out of the way. We're going to let it dry. Before we drill the hole out and just decide to retap it, we're going to try to get the old bolt out with an extractor. This is the type that you bang this in and then you use a wrench and work it back and forth. So I'll bang this in now. You have to drill the hole to an appropriate size based on the size of the extractor. And we're doing it from the front side, and we're going to try to pull the bolt out this way. Twist it out. Oh. So the extractor broke, so I'm going to bang out the extractor with a punch. There we go. All right, we're going to up the drill size to 1/4 inch now. Okay. We're gonna heat this up a little bit. If you were reusing your ball joint, you don't want to do this, obviously, but we're gonna try to get the knuckle a little bit warm. To eliminate the black smoke, we're gonna try to take the boot off. Wipe up all the grease that we can get. Just gonna put this rag over here and just in case something pops. Hopefully it doesn't catch on fire. I'm gonna put some gloves on, slide this over my extractor. It's my 13mm wrench. I'm just gonna go back and forth a little bit. May not work. Oops. All right, we're gonna bang that extractor out because that didn't work either. Unfortunately, when we were drilling, we tried to get this bolt out. We drilled it not quite center, and we tried extracting it. We tried heating it up, and it's just too far gone. So we had to get a new knuckle. We got this from a local salvage yard. This one didn't come with a hub or a ball joint, so we got a new ball joint from 1aauto.com and a new hub. Unfortunately, we live in New England and this bolt was rusted in solid. You may have another solution for this, but for us, this is what we're gonna do. Because we didn't have this knuckle on the vehicle and the bolts were so rusted, we didn't have the leverage to be able to use a breaker bar or a ratchet, so we used an impact and a 14mm socket. The hub is stuck in there pretty good. It won't just pull out, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna just tighten the bolts just a little bit, just to get a couple threads on there. Then we're gonna use a hammer. We're gonna tap out the hub. We're gonna hold the knuckle. As you can see, the shield is starting to get loose, so the hub is separating from the knuckle. There we go. We can take our bolts out. Tap it a little bit. There it is. And there's our shield. So our new knuckle is pretty rusty, so the hub doesn't really fit in there all that well. You don't really want it to fall right in there, but there is some rust here, so I'm just taking a file. I'm just gonna try to file a little bit of the surface rust off this. You don't really wanna get down there too much, but just a little bit is fine. When we were taking the hub off, we hit the dust shield a little bit. So we're gonna take this hammer from 1aauto.com and we're gonna bang it back down. Just flatten it down like that. It looks nice and straight. We're gonna put our dust shield back on. We're gonna install our hub. Before I install the hub, I'm gonna use a little bit of anti-seize just around the hub. You might want to do this if you know you're going to keep the vehicle for a long time. You may have to take it apart again sometime. This will keep everything from seizing up just a little bit. Line that up there. Now if you're if your bolts got messed up when removing and they got hammered down, you can shave them down a little bit with like a die grinder or something, or get new bolts would be a good idea. I'm just gonna put a little anti-seize on these bolts also. All right, now we're gonna snug these down with a 14mm socket, extension and a ratchet. All right, so we'll snug these up before we're gonna torque them. So we're gonna put our knuckle in our vise so that it's easier for us to torque. We're gonna torque this with a 14mm socket and a torque wrench to 88 foot-pounds. We're gonna install our knuckle and hub assembly. We're gonna slide it through the axle first. And then we're gonna hold the strut and get that lined in. Take these bolts. Remember, this is the bolt that's cammed with the paint mark on the top. Get that in first. And get the other bolt in. That one will go next. We have our nut right here. Now I'm not going to torque these yet because this is all very loose. It's going to be hard to torque these while everything's so loose, so I'm going to hook everything else up first and then we'll put those nuts on and torque those. So before we install our ball joint, you want to clean in this area. You can take a little wire brush, get as much of the rust out as possible, or you can use a file and just file it. Make sure it's clean so that the new ball joint slips in fairly easily. Just in case we ever have to do this job again, we're going to put a little bit of anti-seize on the ball joint. That'll make it so it will not rust in there like our original one. Make it easier removal if we ever have to do it again. Slide it in. Now it's not all the way in. We're gonna slip our control arm on the stud first. So pull down. Get it in the stud. Now we can use a hammer and hammer up. And as you can see, it's all the way up, so that's good. Make sure you don't hammer on the threads of the ball joint because you don't want to ruin those threads. So we'll install our bolt that holds the ball joint in. Remember, our old bolt broke right in this location, so we just want to add some more anti-seize on this. It's messy and it gets everywhere, but this will save you from headaches in the future. We have this lock washer. We're going to put that on the bolt and then install the bolt. So we're going to use a 16mm socket and a ratchet, snug it down, and then we'll torque it. So we're going to torque this ball joint bolt with a 16mm socket and a torque wrench to 36.9 foot-pounds. There we go. Before I install this ball joint nut, it's going to be easier to put the link in now because then I'll be able to move around the lower control arm. So get this in. There we go. That's in. And I can put the nuts on. 15mm socket and a ratchet. Start tightening these down. As you can see, the stud is starting to move, so I'm gonna need a wrench or some pliers. Because it's tight in there, I'm gonna use some needle nose pliers, locking pliers. It'll just hold it for me while I tighten it up. Now we're gonna torque these nuts with a 15mm socket and a torque wrench to 33.2 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to install the castle nut on the lower ball joint. They call it a castle nut because if you look at it, it looks like a castle. Install that. So now I'm going to torque this with an 18mm socket and a torque wrench to 28.8 foot-pounds. Now, once you torque it, you're going to look for the hole, and the hole's not lined up exactly. So I'm gonna have to tighten it a little bit more to get the hole lined up for the cotter pin. And now it's lined up. Now I can slip the cotter pin in. All right, so there's a couple different ways you can bend the cotter pin. The way I like to do it is take some diagonal cutters and bend this up this way so it folds, and I'll cut the excess off. And then this one in the back, I'll take a chisel and a hammer and just tap it up. And then I'll cut the excess off of here. Next, this is our cotter pin from our outer tie rod. It broke when we were taking the nut off. It just broke it off, but we have to remove that so that we can get our new cotter pin in. So I'm going to use a punch and a hammer, see if I can bang it out. If not, we're going to try to drill it out. So that didn't work, so we're going to use a small drill bit and try to drill it out. You don't have to go in straight because it really doesn't matter. We're just trying to get the pin out. So. Go back to a bigger drill bit. There we go, got it all out. We're gonna reinstall the tie rod up into our knuckle. Push up. Take our castle nut. Stick that on. I'm gonna torque this castle nut with a 19mm socket and a torque wrench. I'm gonna have to use an extension because the dust shield's in the way. So I'll torque it to 19 foot-pounds. Our castle nut lined up with the hole, but if yours doesn't, then you can tighten the castle nut more to get the cotter pin to line up. And for this one, we'll do the same as the lower. With some dikes, pull this over. And cut the excess off. There we go. All right, so now that our lower control arm is on and our tie rod is on, this is very stable. We're able to torque these nuts for the strut. So we'll put those nuts on. We'll use a wrench on this side. Remember, we painted our mark on the top of the bolt, so we want to make sure that paint mark is up top. That'll get our alignment closer, but remember, when doing this repair with a lot of front-end components, you're going to want to have an alignment done so that you do not wear your tires out. We'll tighten these down. We're using a 19mm wrench and a 19mm socket and a ratchet. So now we're going to torque these bolts, the nuts and bolts, to 112 foot-pounds. There you go. Same with the bottom one. I'm going to torque this axle nut with a 34mm socket a torque wrench, and I'm going to use a pry bar to hold this from spinning. You can lower the vehicle down and set the pry bar up and then torque it, but I'm just going to muscle it. The torque spec is 162 foot-pounds. All right, next we're going to peen this axle nut down. This just locks it so that when you're driving down the road, it won't loosen up on you. So we'll use a punch and a hammer. Sometimes it's easier to use a chisel. And you just want it bent down just a little bit. And that's good. Next, we're going to install our wheel speed sensor. It goes in this hole here. Push it down. And we're going to use our 10mm bolt. Get that started. Then we're going to use a 10mm socket, an extension, and a ratchet. Tighten this down. And once it's snug, just a little bit more, and it's good. Install our rotor. I'll take a lug nut just to put it on so that it holds the rotor in place. Like that. And we can take our caliper off, take the bungee cord off. And install the caliper. We're going to install these bolts, line the caliper up. These bolts go into the caliper bracket. Start tightening these down with a 17mm socket, an extension, and a ratchet. We're going to torque these bolts down to 89 foot-pounds. And we're going to pull off our lug nut so we can put our wheel on. Throw the wheel up. Install our lug nuts. Just going to tighten these down by hand. Now we're going to lower the vehicle. Now we're going to torque these to 89 foot-pounds. You're going to do it in a star pattern. That will make sure that the wheel is installed properly up against the rotor. Now before you drive away, you're going to want to make sure that you pump the brake pedal slowly, multiple times, because there will be an air gap between the brake pads and the caliper. So when you pump it, it will push the fluid back to the caliper and compress the brake pads.
Thanks for watching. Visit us at oneauto.com for quality auto parts, fast and free shipping, and the best customer service in the industry.